Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear closing statements relating to Module 4, and the first of those is going to be made by Ms. Allison Munroe, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of those of the bereaved survivors and residents whom she represents. So, Ms. Munroe, would you like to take your place at the lectern? And we're ready to hear you as soon as you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Ms. Estevan. Good morning, Mr. Akbor. These are the submissions in closing to Module 4 on behalf of the bereaved survivors and residents represented by the T2 group of lawyers. Can I start by taking you back, as it were, back to the opening submissions in this module made by Professor Thomas, Queen's Counsel? You may recall that during those opening submissions, he took us to the headlines that were at the time circulating in the media, which spoke of the chaos, the lack of leadership, the despair of the survivors, residents and bereaved families. RBKC was failing in their responsibilities to the community, and they were failing spectacularly. There was frustration, there were tears. This abject failure, we say, by RBKC added to the trauma that people were already experiencing. And for once, the headlines were not exaggerations or hyperbole. If anything, they understated the reality. In the course of this module, we have gone behind those headlines to the lived experiences of the survivors, the residents, and the bereaved families, who were so appallingly let down by their local council and by central government. The council leader, Nick Paget-Brown, speaking on BBC Radio 4's The World at One at the time, sought to defend himself and officials against criticisms. He said staff had been on the ground since soon after the fire started, and added, I quote, "All I'm keen to say is there is an effective, coordinated relief effort on the ground, and I'm sorry if people have not seen that." Those comments were patently untrue and, quite frankly, errant nonsense. The painful accounts of what people had to endure in the immediate aftermath of the disaster should make us all ashamed. RBKC failed to provide a planned, effective emergency response. This was a council whose response was chaotic and seemed to be gripped with paralysis and inertia. There was a leadership vacuum. People who were at the very nadir of their suffering were left without proper direction. They required relief, shelter, warmth, sustenance, and psychological support. This council's invisibility and failure to communicate with the survivors and people who wanted to help exacerbated the trauma. In our written submissions, we quoted the words of Karim Musli, to whom the inquiry heard at the beginning of this module. I would like to revisit those words again. They are well worth repeating, as Karim so eloquently articulated the thoughts and experiences of many. He said this: "I thought we lived in a country where the people we vote for and the people that are put in place to look after its people, its most vulnerable people, would help, would come swooping in, and it never happened. The sad part about that, they never planned to. They don't care about us. They care more about themselves, their pockets. And I won't go into detail because you questioned these crooks. You sat there and spoke to these criminals who acted so fraudulently and with this constant detachment. I mean, how many more politicians, ministers and lords are going to insult our dead families before something is done about what happened to us? And it's sad. I've almost completely lost faith in humanity. I've almost completely lost faith in the world because it's always the same thing everywhere. We suffer and they prosper. And I've said this before, the system isn't broken. It was built this way specifically to benefit them. Our families died in the most public and horrific way possible. And here we are, 5 years later, with no arrests, no accountability, but yet the ones who were put in charge or the ones who were involved have been able to prosper since the fire. And how can we allow this to happen? I feel like as time goes on, the general public have forgotten about us, or every time they hear about us, they're fed up. And this is a problem. People need to see themselves in us. People need to understand that what's happened to us and what's happening to us is also happening to them. Putting aside those corporates that behave in the way they behave because it's in their nature, it's what they do, but the government's duty is to protect us, to look after its people. But yet, only last week, a lord was sitting here calling our families nameless, getting the numbers mixed up with Hillsborough, and couldn't even say Grenfell. He said Grenbell. And these are the people put in place to look after us. Those words, "they don't care about us," have reverberated throughout this entire inquiry at every point and intersection between the BSRs, local and central governments, and the corporate CPs. Our clients have said and continue to say, the local and central government did not care about us when the tower was being refurbished. They did not care about us when we were raising issues and warning of the consequences of inaction long before the fire. They did not care about us when these warnings came to pass. So are we surprised that they did not care when people were at their very lowest in the wake of the devastation? They did not care. They never have. The response by both local and central government to this disaster was unacceptable. It was inept. It was inhumane. There was a lack of respect for the residents and engagement with the community. With the embers of the tower still glowing hot, the spin and deflection began. David Kerry made the following comment in his witness statement. General community feeling is of hurt and anger. This is being stoked by a small number of known local instigators who continue to fabricate stories in order to further their aims. When questioned about that, he said that he thought, and I quote, "a suspicion that in amongst a great deal of completely genuine and justified criticisms, it was within the scope of a handful of people who were all the time, well before the fire, extremely antagonistic to the council to make matters even worse." We ask, why would a responsible authority even seek to raise matters such as this at a time when people were in such physical and emotional pain? The community's heart was literally broken, and yet some were being characterised as the villains of the piece. But was David Kerry not articulating the deeply held belief within RBKC that positioned themselves in opposition to the residents? There were no instigators, there were no agents provocateurs sowing the seeds of discontent and fabricating stories. These were baseless and deeply offensive slurs. Yet there were armed police in place at the Westway Centre. RBKC staff were not wearing identification. Some people were threatened with arrest and made to feel like criminals at the Westway Centre. This focus on public order detracted resources and focus away from the relief effort. That RBKC felt emboldened and entitled enough to do this is illustrative of their own agenda and motivation at the time. This we find extraordinary, inexcusable, and unforgivable. This attitude was exemplified in the most egregious way at the Westway Centre. There was the insensitivity of the police cordon, which again illustrates a hostile approach by RBKC, seeing residents and survivors as the enemy. It was aptly described by Rupinder Harvey as being like a crime scene. Residents and survivors described the interviews at the Westway as robotic and little more than tick-box exercises. This was corroborated by Mark Sims of RPT. The lack of coordination meant that people had to repeat and therefore relive their story and their trauma to myriad individuals and agencies, causing further distress. It was, in the words of Mark Sims, inhumane and cruel. They did not care about us. Professor Thomas, Queen's Counsel, also mentioned in his opening to this module the elephant in the room, that being race, ethnicity, and discrimination in all its forms. Now, during the course of this module, people have tried to move around the elephant, under the elephant, squeeze past the elephant, but he very much is still there and is not going away. Racism and discrimination, we say, played a very real part in the response to this tragedy. The playing field was not level. It never has been. One of the measures by which we look at whether we as a society are functioning properly is how we treat our most vulnerable members. Do we treat them with care, respect, and equality? Do we make the necessary adjustments? Now, we have set out in detail in our written submissions the legal framework of the Equality Act, the public sector equality duty, and in regards to the CCA, issues involving vulnerable people and discrimination. So I mention now only the highlights and headlines of those acts. RBKC, as a local authority, had obligations under Section 149 of the Equality Act, specifically to have due regard to the aims of the general equality duty when making decisions and setting policies. With respect to the PSED, this meant having due regard and to the need to A, eliminate discrimination, harassment, victimisation, and any other conduct that is prohibited by or under the 2010 Act. B, to advance equality of opportunity between persons who share a relevant protected characteristics and persons who do not share it. And C, to foster good relations between persons who share a relevant protected characteristics and persons who do not share it. The CCA Chapter 5, Emergency Planning, specifically states that plans, and I quote, should have regard to the vulnerable, i.e. those with mobility difficulties, those with mental health difficulties, or those who are dependent, such as children, and survivors and others affected, those directly affected by the emergency, or the anxiety of not knowing what has happened. Chapter 7 of the Act, Communicating with the Public, stipulates that Category 1 responders need both to plan their communications and to regularly test their communication arrangements to ensure they are effective. The message must be right for the targeted audience, and this must be coordinated with other Cat 1 responders and engaging Cat 2 responders and the voluntary sectors. Now, these pieces of legislation are not there just for show or to look good. They are not mere window dressing. These are overarching pieces of legislation, and they must be embedded within public bodies and inform all aspects of public bodies, their planning, their training, their delivery of services, their practices. This is even more pressing when one examines Kensington and Chelsea's demographics. We said in our opening to this inquiry almost 5 years ago, the very first set of openings, that in examining this disaster, one must put it in its socio-economic context. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea is the richest borough in London. London is the richest city in the UK. The UK is the 5th richest G20 nation based upon GDP per capita. This happened in a very wealthy borough. But there's more to it, because when one looks at the RBKC Borough Risk Register, which is an important document for emergency planners to assist them to make informed decisions, and it was overseen by none other than David Kerry, the profile for RBKC's population showed that the borough had an estimated 178,600 this is from the 2011 census, and is, quote, a borough of extremes, with some of the wealthiest neighbourhoods in the country, as well as some of the most deprived. Grenfell Tower was in North Kensington, where A, the population varied in age, sex and religion. B, more than a fifth of all households have a first language that was not English. C, less than half of the residents, 48%, were born in the UK. D, 28% of residents had arrived in the UK between 2001 and 2011. And E, as a borough, RBKC had the second highest proportion of Arab residents, 4%, after Westminster. RBKC's civil contingency manager, David Kerry, had a duty to ensure that the borough's civil contingency plans and policy reflected its target group. It did not. Module 4 has laid bare the inadequacy and simple disregard that existed in the borough by the RBKC, TMO, and indeed central government for equality legislation. It was not embedded in their thinking. Indeed, we say it formed no part of their thinking. The contingency plans and arrangements and RBKC's response to the fire failed to take into account those in the community with protected characteristics. Mr. Hurd, the former MP and former minister, would not accept that prejudiced or institutional indifference towards the BSRs played a part in the response. We do not propose to take the panel through our detailed written submissions in which we set out the experiences of many of our clients, because we know that you've read that. But we say this, and we say it loudly and clearly, that their evidence, the admissions made on behalf of RBKC, and when one looks critically at the evidence of Mr. Kerry and Mr. Holgate, show that discrimination did indeed play a part in this response. It is disappointing to see the former minister, Mr. Hurd, fail to acknowledge this. With, we say, classic political spin, he said this: what I do absolutely accept is that the response in the immediate aftermath of the fire was wholly inadequate and might have led some people to believe there was institutional indifference. People did not misconceive it. They did not imagine it. Those who felt it knew it. Nicholas Hurd, so-called Minister for Grenfell victims, can pretend not to see it, but the institutional indifference was there. The discrimination was there, and it was very real. Mr. Kerry and RBKC failed to take appropriate steps, having due regard to the needs to advance equality and opportunity, in particular with regards to the need to remove or minimise disadvantage suffered by persons who share irrelevant protected characteristics that are connected to that characteristic, and B, to take steps to meet the needs of persons who share irrelevant protected characteristics that are different from the needs of persons who do not share it. Town Clerk Nicholas Holgate perhaps epitomised this indifference and casual disregard with his lack of awareness as to RBKC's ability, or inability rather, to identify vulnerable persons out of hours. Mr. Kerry flagged this problem in emails in March of 2017, so a few months before the fire, and it was discussed during humanitarian assistance board meetings. Mr. Holgate admitted he should have been aware of this issue. They did not care about us. Race, ethnicity, and religion. It was an obvious and basic need that communication would need to be targeted to non-English speakers in order to provide them with accessible emergency advice and information. This was not done. This is discriminatory. There was a delay or failure to provide counsellors who spoke the language of the bereaved, survivors and residents. This was not done. This was discriminatory. There was limited or lack of flexibility in accommodation offered to make allowances for Muslim mealtimes during Ramadan or attendance at prayers and meeting. And food provided was not culturally appropriate in some instances, and in other instances, halal food was not provided at all. This was discriminatory. The panel will have recalled Nabil Shouker's evidence during this module, inviting the panel to examine the issue of institutional discrimination and its role in the disaster. In his words, we need to have institutional discrimination looked at as part of the terms of reference. Members of the panel, questions of race are, we say, inextricably linked with Grenfell. We need to look no further than the MPS's categorising of risk and threats in the aftermath. The MPS Grenfell Community Impact Assessment, created by RBKC Police Branch to record the actions taken by the police and its partner agencies in the aftermath of the fire, attributed imminent threats of an outbreak of crime and disorder to the Muslim background of the victims. The entry of the 18th of June read, imminent local, national or international events taken alone or in combination expected to lead to outbreaks of crime and or disorder within hours. Rationale. There is an expectation that the final death toll from the fire could rise substantially, and with the cause still unknown, any subsequent disclosure would have the impact of community tensions, especially when the majority of those affected are believed to be or come from a Muslim cultural background, combined with the incident occurring during the holy month of Ramadan. Members of the panel, this is Islamophobia. It's racism, the elephant staring back at us in the room. Disability. BSRs with disabilities were known to RBKC and to the TMO. They were known to adult services. They were known to RBKC disability services. Yet, still, they too were treated with indignity and disregard. We had, in the aftermath, people who were frightened. They were grieving for friends, relatives, for neighbours. They were bereft of all their worldly possessions. These residents were placed nonetheless in hotels on high floors, in rooms that were not adapted for their most basic needs. There was no consideration of mobility issues or non-visible disabilities, to use the phrase that Mr. Sims has used already. It was inhumane and cruel. Pregnant women. A number of expectant mothers who survived the fire, traumatised enough by that, found themselves in hotels or shelters which were not equipped to meet their medical needs and requirements. They were living and sleeping in entirely inappropriate accommodation. This impacted upon their physical and mental well-being. Children. Children are a particularly important group here, and we spent some time, both in the opening and in the closing written submissions, addressing the issue as to children and the disproportionate number of children that not only died in the fire, but those who suffered as a result in the aftermath. The Equality and Human Rights Commission report, entitled Following Grenfell, was based on interviews with family, and they found that many children who lost a friend or family member or their home in the fire struggled to access help. David Isaacs, the Commission chair, said this: "There are so many children going to the same school and still affected," one respondent said. "They just don't know where to turn because there aren't the services available." Supporting families who lost friends and loved ones that night should have been a primary concern, but especially the children involved. While authorities sought to respond to the disaster, children received disjointed mental health and educational support. Their needs and rights were slipped through the cracks. Families found themselves in hotel rooms with no facilities to sterilise bottles and cots if they had small children, babies and infants. School-aged children, some of whom had exams to sit that week, had no uniforms to go to school in. They had no room to study. Often whole families were sharing one hotel room, so teenagers had no privacy and no space. At the other end of the spectrum are the elderly. And although Module 4 focused on the 7 days after the fire, the response to the fire is long-lasting and far-reaching, with greater impact on vulnerable people such as the elderly, and this has been clear from the evidence heard and the news reports that we alluded to in our opening and I've alluded to at the beginning of these submissions. One of our clients, Elżbieta Konazuska, was 80 years of age, and on the night of the fire, she was evacuated from her home in Grenfell Walk, where she'd lived for the past 35 years. She, like Michael John, of whom the inquiry has heard in the opening, was one of the forgotten people by RBKC in this aftermath. She received no subsistence or housing support until many months later. She was belatedly offered temporary housing and was put through further trauma when later rehoused in a property which had multiple fire safety issues, resulting in the decanting of residents. The failure to rehouse Elżbieta in settled accommodation after the fire had a detrimental effect on her health, and sadly she died in January of this year at the age of 85, 4.5 years after the fire, awaiting still placement in sheltered accommodation. Mental health. We have set out in our written submissions the mental health impact on this disaster. The aftermath of this fire created a mental health crisis that cannot be understated or underestimated and is probably still being underreported. In August of 2017, so only a few months after the fire, BBC Newsnight reported that 600 people had so far received counselling, including 100 children. That was the tip of the iceberg. By October 2017, The Guardian was reporting that the mental health response following the fire was the biggest operation of its kind in Europe, according to one doctor, with a number of people affected likely to exceed 11,000. As with the other provisions of services for the BSRs, psychological and mental health support in the immediate aftermath was woefully inadequate. Rest centres. The alacrity with which the voluntary sector filled that leadership vacuum created by the inertia of RBKC and TMO was matched only by the speed with which RBKC began to malign the names of certain residents and their intentions. Whilst those in positions of authority at the local authority, at the council, dithered and prevaricated, arriving on scene many hours after finding out about the fire, Mark Sim of Rugby Portobello Trust, RPT, sprang into action some 120 miles away in Nottingham and immediately set about providing aid and support to the BSRs once here in London. He summed it up perfectly. The North Kensington community was looking after its own people in the absence of anything coming from anywhere else. It's a sad indictment, really, that people were getting out of bed to help their fellow neighbours when other people weren't getting out of their offices to help our citizens. Pausing there for a moment, it's worth perhaps mentioning the MPS again, because very little has been said about them in this inquiry. In their closing statement, they focus on the Casualty Bureau and Family and Friends Reception Centre, conceding that it needs to give consideration as to how the role of the Casualty Bureau should be better communicated in the future. It needs to consider how its operation could be improved and how it might fit into wider systems of disseminating information about those who are missing as part of an improved humanitarian response. All we would say to that is, well, an adherence to the Equality Act, the PSED, would be a very good start. The TMO. Whilst brevity in lawyers is always to be commended, it is noted in its very short written closing submissions that the TMO has continued to emphasise that it was not a Category 1 responder. It says that its emergency plan had no effect on the fire or the aftermath. We find that statement extraordinary, but there's more. It goes on to say that the TMO staff were present in the rest centres, and if they did not seem visible to BSRs, that might have been down to how busy it was. No. That explanation is an affront and insult to the intelligence of our clients. It is not an acceptable or credible explanation, and we reject it wholeheartedly, and we invite the chair and the panel to do likewise. The TMO's position has consistently been that it was obvious from the scale of the fire that their emergency plan was not relevant and that RBK's emergency plan would prevail. Its role, it says, therefore, was to support and assist once decisions had been made, rather than to make decisions itself, and to respond to requests made of it by RBKC and other agencies where appropriate. Mr. Black went further by saying that that is how it was planned and operated. There was quite clearly a lack of coordination between RBKC and the TMO, and it is acknowledged by RBKC in its written closing document. They say, and I quote, RBKC admits that it and the TMO never formally agreed what the role of the TMO would be in the event of an emergency, and it acknowledges that it would have been better if the role of the TMO in the event of an emergency had been set out in writing before the fire. This might have enabled better use to be made of TMO's willingness to assist. Firstly, we say this shows a fundamental failure on the part of both RBKC and the TMO to appreciate what the TMO's role could and should have been in the event of a large-scale emergency. Planning, training and preparation are key to emergency response, and the role of the TMO staff should have been firmly embedded in RBKC's emergency planning. We know from the evidence that RBKC simply did not have enough staff who were suitably trained in emergency planning and response. This is a gap which could and should have been filled by TMO staff. This is because the TMO is not just a TMO, it is also an arm's-length management organisation, ALMO, with responsibility for the management of the entirety of RBKC's housing stock. It therefore needed to perform the functions of a local authority internal housing department. An authority's housing department is, of course, part of the authority itself, and therefore part of a Category 1 responder. As such, it is fully integrated within the authority's emergency plan and provides staff trained to act as part of a coordinated response with other local authority departments. Secondly, RBKC and the TMO should have realised this was an obvious point. It should never have been the case that the TMO had, quote, no formal role except to provide resource and support on an ad hoc basis. The TMO should have been fully integrated within RBKC's emergency response team. The failure to ensure this was the case vastly reduced RBKC's capacity to respond effectively to the fire. RBKC seeks to shift the blame for its failure to agree with the TMO as to their role by relying on the fact that their respective roles were defined by the Modular Management Agreement, MMA, which is issued by government and which fails to address an ALMO's role in an emergency. Central government, therefore, also bears some responsibility for the lack of coordination between RBKC and the TMO in the response to the fire, but that cannot serve to excuse the inadequate planning of both RBKC and the TMO. Both RBKC and the TMO also conveniently ignore the evidence of the TMO's own emergency plan, which recorded that it was intended to work within the framework of RBKC's emergency response. To quote from the plan is primarily for managing local KC-TMO emergencies on, within, or surrounding our properties and estates, one which can be managed within the resources available to KCTMO. However, this plan can also be used for large-scale major events which would overwhelm the KCTMO's ability to manage on its own, and which would involve the RBKC Council resources, the difference being the scale of the emergency and the number of people affected by it. When this was drawn to Mr. Black's attention in his oral evidence, and this part of the emergency plan, he accepted that he had misunderstood the TMO's role and that there was no reason why parts of the TMO's emergency plan could not have been activated alongside RBKC's. Response. This is important because, as Mr. Black accepted, the TMO's role, as stated in the emergency plan, envisaged that TMO staff would be available to undertake roles including setting up rest centres. RBKC has admitted that it did not have enough trained rest centre managers before the fire, and that initially it did not deploy enough council officers of sufficient seniority to rest centres. This, we say, is a crucial failing on the part of both the TMO and RBKC. The TMO should have been able to provide staff trained to establish and run rest centres, and RBKC should have known that this was a resource that, if needed, they could call upon. Miss Brown confirmed in oral evidence that her staff had no training working at rest centres or collating data in an emergency. While at the TMO, Mr. Black received no training in emergency planning and response, nor had he attended any joint training with RBKC about how its plans would work in practice. Likewise, Miss Brown had no emergency training whilst at the TMO. She gave evidence that employees on the out-of-hours rota had received training. However, significantly, this was not corroborated by one of her own employees, Kiran Singh, who says in his witness statement that he attended no training or exercises in the emergency plan. This is a crucial and critical admission, as it was Mr. Singh who was primarily tasked with collating details of residents on the night of the fire, including the safe missing list. That proved to be something of a disaster. The inquiry took Miss Brown through that spreadsheet of the safe missing list in its various versions at length and demonstrated how terrible mistakes were made so that residents were recorded as being both safe and missing at the same time. That led to relatives being told that their loved ones had survived when that was not the case. Such appalling mistakes should have been avoided and could have been avoided had there been proper training and preparation. The TMO had previous fires from which lessons should have been learnt. Following the fire at Adair Tower in October 2015, RBKC and the TMO knew that they needed to improve their coordination during an emergency. 2 years before Grenfell, on the 11th of November 2015, a meeting of the TMO's executive team concluded that better integration between RBKC and the TMO was necessary. Despite this, on the night of the fire at Grenfell Tower, the TMO still lacked a clearly and formally defined role in the event of RBKC's contingency planning systems being invoked. Such was the lack of coordination between the two that Mr. Black confirmed. RBKC didn't even telephone the TMO's out-of-hours contact number. His role at RBKC's goal group was, he says, quote, just to be there and see what you could provide. The total lack of coordination is graphically illustrated by Miss Brown's evidence that not only did she never have any contact with Sue Redman during the emergency, but she did not know that Sue Redman was the halo or even what the halo's role was. Following the Adair Tower fire, the key role identified for the TMO in an emergency affecting the homes of council tenants was to attend the scene of the emergency with a list of known residents. That was to include identification of residents with any vulnerabilities. As Miss Brown accepted in her evidence, that was a perfectly good opportunity to update the emergency plan and the annexed sets of details for each tower, block and estate. In its written closing, the TMO says this: "It is acknowledged that there were deficiencies in the emergency plan. However, these did not impact delivery of the TMO services during the aftermath." That, I'm afraid, beggars belief. The TMO's emergency plan stated it included information on the numbers of known vulnerable residents to be included on the block details which form part of this plan. The information specific to Grenfell Tower was completed in 2002, and it had not been updated, despite the emergency plans purporting to be the 2016 version. It therefore took no account of the refurbishment works and stated there were 120 dwellings, not 129, approximately 330 to 360 residents, and that the likely number of vulnerable residents was between 8 and 12. All those figures, all those stats are wrong. It contained no further information about the location of these residents nor the nature of their vulnerability. So far from being of assistance to the emergency services and RBKC in responding to the fire, it was actively misleading and a hindrance. Although the TMO was the obvious first port of call for information on residents, RBKC's departments, such as adult social care and children's services, also have records which should and could have recorded the composition of a tenant's household and, more specifically, would have assisted in identifying vulnerable residents. Yet there was no sharing of data held on residents between the TMO and these departments, as both Miss Brown and Miss Redmond confirmed. It is clearly essential that responders have information about those affected by an emergency, which is as accurate as possible and available as soon as possible. It is undoubtedly the case that the quality of the information would have been greatly improved if there had been an existing database which collated all the information available to the TMO and to RBKC's Social Services Department. So why was there no such database created? Well, it appears from the evidence given by Amanda Johnson in Module 3 that there were concerns about breaching data protection rules. There was, however, no reason why a data sharing agreement could not have been put in place between the TMO and RBKC. Even though sensitive personal data about vulnerable residents could not have been shared without their consent, surely that consent would have been given if it was properly explained that it would be used in an emergency. We suggest the inquiry should recommend that such collated databases be kept by all social landlords and local authority social services department. But why was the TMO's information so very poor? There is an obvious answer: the distant attitude of the TMO to the residents it was meant to serve. The evidence in Module 3 demonstrated how the petitions, pleas and warnings of residents were ignored. The evidence in Module 4 yet again showed that residents were not given the respect and dignity that they deserved. How can this be, given that the TMO was a tenant management organisation, emphasis on the tenant? The answer is that it was a TMO, but it was, as the inquiry is well aware, a unique TMO. Tenant management organisations were envisaged as, and usually are, locally based community bodies formed by groups of tenants and leaseholders. Imagine how much better the information on residents would have been if the estates had been managed by a TMO set up by and for the residents of the estates and staffed by housing officers who were properly integrated within the local community. The concept of the TMO is not flawed, but KCTMO was fatally flawed because it was incapable of proper resident engagement, participation, and empowerment. The TMO says in its written closing that issues of information gathering from residents, quote, appears to be an industry-wide social housing problem. If that is so, The reason is that lack of proper resident engagement and participation is also an industry-wide issue. For far too long, residents in social housing have been treated as second-class citizens. The current proposals to strengthen the powers of the regulator of social housing in the Social Housing Regulation Bill in relation to tenants' empowerments are to be welcomed, and we invite the inquiry to make strong recommendations reflecting the need to ensure that residents of social housing have greater participation in decision-making and have a greater access to redress. Housing duties. In our written closing submissions, we set out RBKC's duties to the homeless under the Housing Act 1996. I do not propose to repeat the legal framework today, but emphasise that accommodation secured by a local authority under any of the housing's duties must be suitable, and that in deciding whether accommodation is suitable, the PSED requires that authority to focus on effects of an applicant's vulnerability and cultural needs. In her evidence, Laura Johnson accepted the many failings RBKC have admitted to in their opening. Just a few. Some residents were entitled to emergency accommodation but were not provided with it because they were not made aware of their rights. Some were misled as to their entitlements. Others were not provided with transport to get to their hotels, and they had to rely on the kindness of strangers. In seeking to match accommodation to families' needs, errors were made in relation to the size of the accommodation. There were many examples that we've given of accommodation being provided which lacked appropriate facilities for disabled residents and young children and families. Many were placed in hotels and then left for days without RBKC contacting them to follow up on their support needs, leaving them feeling abandoned by the council. As many families were reliant on food provided by their hotels, as we said, many Muslim families were unable to get halal food. Extraordinarily, in the first few days, RBKC gave no consideration to the floors on which emergency accommodation would be provided. So some residents, having survived the horrors of a high-rise fire, were then placed in high-rise accommodation. One can only imagine how that played out. The failings of her department as part of RBKC's broader failure to comply with its duties under the CCA 2004, in particular proper training of staff and adequate planning. Aside from attending one event in 2015, Laura Johnson had no formal training in contingency management planning and played no part in two significant training exercises which took place in 2015 and 2016. Although there was a housing contingency plan dated 2012, Laura Johnson had failed to update it and was not confident, her words, that her housing team was even aware of it. RBKC's housing department therefore failed to take basic steps which would have prepared them for providing accommodation in a large-scale emergency. As Laura Johnson accepted, having standing arrangements with hotels or hotel groups would have helped to avoid the difficulty encountered in booking rooms because hotels require payment up front. A small and simple thing to rectify a problem that became very, very pressing for a large number of people in the aftermath. I turn then to contingency planning. As we have stated in our written closing, emergency planning, preparedness and the assessment of risk lies at the heart of the civil contingency planning and statutory duties underpinning the Civil Contingency Act. RBKC's failing in relation to its statutory duties pursuant to the CCA 2005 was systemic, and we invite the panel to find that these systemic failings contributed to the abysmal response to the fire. There was a systemic lack of internal oversight of the contingency arrangements, which saw the plans being left unupdated, annexes were left blank or in draft form, they were outdated or they were superseded. Again, Simple and basic oversight and proper governance would have addressed those very, very important issues. Coupled with the systemic lack of oversight, there was a lack of investment in contingency planning, under-resourcing, and a culture steeped in this is how it's done, and a resistance to change. We are reminded of Rebecca Blackburn's evidence of R.B. Casey's response to her concerns about the lack of training in and testing of contingency plans, and David Kerry's inability to cope with what she raised. Tony Redpath's response being that David could cope. Quote, he's been doing this job for this amount of years. He's the advisor to the LAP panel. He's a professional. He'll cope. The evidence in Module 4 has shown that he did not cope. The silencing of Rebecca Burton, placing her on secondment, following her response to the concerns raised about the CMU, also strikes at the heart of R.B. Casey's poor governance. And as we have heard, she returned from secondment in 2016 to a deteriorated state of affairs, with management turning a blind eye to the concerns raised. Given the specialised nature of contingency planning and emergency management, there needs to be greater investment in both. Local authorities, CMUs, and that of responder organisations must be staffed with personnel, including managers who are trained in emergency and disaster management. R.B. Casey's lack of contingency preparedness prior to the fire and its tardy response weaves the familiar thread of neglect of which the residents of the tower complained during the life of the building, and which was sadly the experience of many members of the community in the aftermath. The scene was ripe for R.B. Casey's failed emergency response, which failed an entire community. Although apologies were tendered on behalf of RBKC for its failings, its contingency planning and its response to the fire, the mea culpa has been somewhat qualified. Buck passing again, and defiance is again obvious. This is borne out particularly in David Kerry and his response to questions asked during the course of his evidence about R.B. Casey's role in the provision of premises for rest centres as set out in R.B. Casey's CMP. Although the plan clearly specified that its role in the immediate aftermath included, and I quote, the provision of premises for body holding centres, survivor reception centres, friends and relative reception centres, David Kerry sought and steadfastly sought to deflect responsibility onto the Metropolitan Police, as he did when asked about the council's duty to coordinate communication, and even when confronted with R.B. Casey's own admissions of its failed communications. Mr. Kerry's response to the inquiry's questions on these very obvious failings is indicative, we say, of R.B. Casey's culture of institutional defensiveness, blaming someone in an effort to escape responsibility. If lessons are to be learnt from institutional failings and meaningful change implemented, we as a society must cleanse ourselves of the cancerous culture of institutional defensiveness and buck passing. Candour cannot be lip service. It must constitute the framework of public accountability. In their written closing submission, R.B. Casey accept that contingency arrangements and managements were indeed failings that were systemic and were enabled by an inadequate or non-existent oversight framework. LRF's terms of reference place the onus on the organisation to self-report issues of concern and to fulfil their statutory obligations under the CCA 2005. At the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, there was no national or regional oversight body with statutory powers to ensure compliance with the CCA 2005 or standardisation of CMP provisions and arrangements. This remains the case to date. They also accept further failings in relation to the BEC. Now, it would be churlish not to acknowledge those failings and to welcome them. However, our clients are not going to give RBKC a pat on the back for accepting those failings which we say were blindingly obvious. The risk of fire in high-rise buildings was foreseeable and should have been identified as a risk on RBKC's risk register. Although this risk was ever present, given the prevalence of tower block fires in London, including the Adair Tower fire, which, as I've mentioned, Mr. Carey had personal involvement with as the BEC, the risk of tower block fires was never raised by RBKC of its own initiative, nor with other organisations in the LRF. Mr. Carey's evidence of casual conversations with the LFB at BRF or other events generically about matters to the exclusion of risk of fires in tower blocks also supports a systemic lack of oversight, risk assessment and management. We do not propose to take the panel through our detailed written submissions on London Resilience Framework, which, again, we're very grateful you have read. The panel has heard, we say, sufficient evidence from which to make findings. For the reasons given and the evidence heard, we would invite the panel to make findings of the inadequacy of the resilience framework and the need for a national, regional, quality, contingency management, resilience, compliance and quality assurance organisation or authority, and that needs to have statutory powers. Turning then very briefly to central government. We say sound bites and platitudes characterise the response of central government. We were, and the inquiry, we say, was subjected to a parade of witnesses who simultaneously espoused regrets and apologies whilst failing to properly take ownership of the disastrous manner in which this government dealt with this tragedy. The Grenfell Tower fire was an exceptional national disaster. It required and it needed an exceptional national response at governmental level. What it got was Nicholas Hurd MP, a man only 2 days into his own ministerial appointment as Minister of State for Policing and the Fire Service. In answer to questions as to whether he was adequately briefed the role, he, not surprisingly, admitted he was not. I don't see how I could have been, given this was day 2. In their written closing submissions, DLUHC says this: the department recognises that the commitment to rehouse all affected individuals in the local area in 3 weeks was too ambitious and could not be achieved. This was not only an error, and it wasn't the only error. In its oral opening, the department also acknowledged that it should have been, quote, clearer in the way that its commitment was communicated. It should have emphasised that affected people would be provided with temporary accommodation before being offered permanent accommodation, and that they weren't obliged to accept this offer. Now, it is one thing for someone to decide whether to move into temporary accommodation for 6 months or a year. A decision about whether to accept a council or housing association tenancy intended to be your permanent accommodation is a totally different order. At a time when absolute clarity was necessary, it is truly extraordinary that both central government and local government in the form of RBKC could not send out such confusing messages. RBKC should have been clear in its own mind that the commitment was to provide temporary accommodation. An email from Fiona Darby, DCLG's Deputy Director of Homelessness, to Laura Johnson on the 17th of June summarised what had been promised to RBKC the previous day. The government was in effect offering RBKC a blank cheque to cover the whole cost of temporary accommodation in the private sector until permanent accommodation could be provided. RBKC could book everything available, even if it was not used, because the government would bear the cost. In light of this email, astonishingly, it is clear from Laura Johnson's written and oral evidence that she understood the commitment to be the provision of permanent housing. The 3-week target was not just ambitious, it was totally irresponsible. It should have been obvious to the government that it was impossible to meet the deadline, given the commitment to rehouse locally, the acute shortage of housing, and the sensitive decisions that were involved, ensuring that accommodation was suitable for each and every family's needs. RBKC was placed in a situation where it made offers of accommodation to families, even when it knew that those offers were unsuitable. As Laura Johnson put it in her written evidence, we were making offers we knew survivors would refuse in order to meet the 3-week target and to make sure everyone had been given an offer. Indeed, many residents moved into temporary accommodation, which was subsequently found to be unsuitable, and then had to move again and again. Many waited months or even years to obtain suitable accommodation, and many still have not achieved that and have not been provided with proper permanent homes. Insufficient steps were taken to address these concerns, and the lack of leadership was not functioning properly. Despite considering the issues of an intervention during the weekend following the fire, a decision was made against intervention due to the role played by Gold Command, having taken over RBKC's leadership, and the replacement of Chief Executive and Leader of RBKC. This raises further issues regarding the pan-London approach, the legislation, the effectiveness of the legislative framework, and clear lines of activating the intervention. In terms of central government, there were clear failings. There was a failing by central government to act upon known information that RBKC and its leadership were out of their depth and that people were suffering. Nick Hurd had met with volunteers. He knew that they were filling the leadership vacuum in the response. The system of which Mr. Hurd was a part itself failed. Data provided did not add up. It was inconsistent. Further, there were inadequate resources in place to monitor or oversee RBKC. So, in conclusion, we say, with a large population and complex society that we live in now, the probability of something very unlikely happening is actually very high. In 1 year alone, there was the Manchester Arena bombing, the London Bridge terrorist attack, and the Grenfell Tower fire. Unlikely disasters, all of them, but they all happened. And they were all met with very different responses and very different levels of effectiveness. The response to the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire was woeful and laid bare a catalogue of breaches and failings. The BSRs demand and inspect those responsible to take full ownership of these failings and to acknowledge these and all statutory breaches. It is only by such acknowledgement that the process of accountability can begin. No community should have to go through such painful and degrading experiences as our clients did in the aftermath of this fire. When they should have been protected and enveloped in the protective arms of the state, they were treated as a hindrance, second-class citizens who did not warrant the care, kindness and support that they should have been given immediately and unconditionally. The final words, I return again to one of our clients, Hanan Wahabi, a woman whose eloquence and quiet dignity and gravitas embodies this proud, brave and resilient community of people. This is what Hanan said to this inquiry. We were treated like numbers, not humans. This is something that we still feel today. In my experience, in the eyes of local and central government, our Grenfell and North Kensington community are second class, the people with needs and problems. I cannot help but feel that had our community lived in a different part of the borough, on the more affluent side, Had we been from a different class, had we been less ethnic, the response in the aftermath would have been immediate. It would have been present. It would have been felt. We may be different, we may be diverse, but we are people. Think of the different professions in the tower, of the challenges that so many from the BAME community have overcome prior to the fire in 2017. Think of the dignity demonstrated by those of us impacted over the last 5 years. We are human beings. We contribute, we pay tax, we provide leadership in our communities. This tragedy has pierced wounds in each and every one of us in ways that one cannot imagine. We may now and again put plasters to hide our wounds, but they are still there, and sometimes, indeed many times, those plasters fall off. To this day, the support that have been given is only provided after jumping through hoops, whether it's fighting to get housing repairs done or get the medical support we need. We are forever asked to prove that we have been impacted, forever having to prove our pain. This duty of care needs to extend beyond us to the rest of the country, to the thousands of families who live in communities like us, like we had at Grenfell, who are still treated as second-class citizens. It needs to extend to the thousands impacted by the building safety crisis up and down the country. We are all still impacted. We still hurt. We still remember. We haven't forgotten. All the issues we have, the PTSD, the mental and physical trauma that you see as problems in us, this isn't who we are. This is who some of us are now because of what the government did to us. Because of your absence, because you were not there, because you did not show that you cared, you have sapped all the energy from us. Those that caused this tragedy must be held accountable. Their duty of care to us now has no limit. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, at this point, we're going to take the morning break. We'll rise now. We'll resume, please, at 11:25. As you will all realise, we're running slightly behind time, and so I would encourage those who are coming next to keep their remarks within the span allotted. Thank you very much. Anyway, 11:25. Thank you. The next statement is going to be made by Mr. Friedman, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of those of the bereaved survivors and residents whom he represents. Yes, Mr. Friedman.
Good morning. Panel, if the subject matter of democratic government is the people, then the Phase 2 evidence demonstrates something profoundly wrong, that people were left so exposed in both the origins and the aftermath of the fire. While this inquiry must therefore conclude on what is needed to better regulate the built environment and the emergency response to its fragility, the study of the fire's aftermath raises an equally important question of this disaster. How can we make democracy more social? The Module 4 evidence focuses on that question through 5 lenses: people, community, borough, city and state. And through those lenses, we say certain basic features of what might be regarded as a good and just society are missing. They include respect for human dignity as an overriding societal value, real community engagement as a primary goal of all levels of government, effective emergency organisation for the well-being of cities, and genuine human and social concern at the heart of state. From these missing features flowed the following wrongs in what this module calls aftermath, but which can now be properly viewed as the continuation of the disaster. First, people were resilient, but the acts and omissions of government often made them vulnerable. Second, there was a practical and moral collapse of local government for reasons foreshadowed in pre-fire relations. Third, whatever its improved contribution to recovery, an improvised London command structure took power on the barest of legal foundations. And fourth, the modern discourse and practices of civil contingency, and particularly its core features of subsidiarity and resilience, had in this instance profoundly antisocial consequences. Starting with people. The BSR's overriding accusation is that the system did not care about them. Consider again Hanan Wahhabi's declaration: we may be different, we may be diverse, but we are people, we are human beings. Mahmoud al-Qarad urged, I am a human, I have feelings. Muhammad Rasul learned that those in power don't care about their constituents because they can't relate to them. Hanan Chabika and those on the walkways discovered we did not matter because we didn't come out of the town, we didn't lose anybody. Muna El Ogbani found no understanding, no empathy or sympathy, no culture. And what she wanted for people is to be taken seriously and treated with dignity and respect. And Karim Musili, the system isn't broken, it was built this way. And people need to see themselves in us. People need to understand that what's happened to us and what's happening to us is also happening to them. Now, these are criticisms of contemporary bureaucracy and should be taken seriously as systemic problems and not just the neglect of a rogue borough that RBKC was. One of the key gaps in the copious central and local government emergency planning documents is they do not speak of people. They refer instead to categories of vulnerable persons, of the voluntary community sector, of faith groups and of essential services, but they do not require focus on the qualities and needs of individuals or everyday groups of people. This absence of basic human counting flows down through the rest of the emergency system. The regime, we are told, relies on subsidiarity, defined in the documents as the principle that decisions should be taken at the lowest appropriate level with coordination at the highest necessary level. It may have some logic as regards local knowledge, but based on what this inquiry has learned across its modules, subsidiarity is another species of unaccountable and unmonitored localism. A powerful example of this is that before the fire, central government gave no thought to the fact that following a disaster, mass displacement would likely have a disproportionate effect on lower income groups. It was not considered in the compilation of the National Risk Register or in the lead department planning. Catherine Hammond in the Cabinet Office and Melanie Dawes at DCLG could recognise the point when questioned, but on grounds of subsidiarity, they declared it something exclusively to be dealt with at the local level. In one swoop of doctrine, the major reality of any disaster, that those with less financial means will suffer most, gets entirely contracted out of central government responsibility, and it does so by design. And once in the midst of the Grenfell disaster, no one in government considered it an obvious problem that the local authority who owned the building and was therefore primarily responsible to account for its lack of fire safety was to lead on response and recovery for the fire's victims. Subsidiarity turned out to be to civil contingency what stay put is to fire and rescue. It's a policy assumption that was allowed to become imprisoning as an article of faith. A further problematic concept that runs across the documents is resilience. Dictionary definition refers to the innate capacity in nature, physics, or psychology to rebound or spring back. Resilience could therefore serve as a marker of the power and creativity of humans to respond to adversity, especially with public sector support. However, the Cabinet Office definition of resilience refers to the ability of the community, services, area or infrastructure to detect, prevent, or if necessary to withstand, handle and recover from disruptive challenges. Its relevant levels, including its proper noun, the community, do not include individuals, the public, or normal community life. Resilience is essentially reserved for formal organisations, structure, and services. What the documents really refer to is resilience of state. Those who cannot be resilient due to poverty or disability are lumped under a catch-all of the vulnerable. No account is given to how inequality creates vulnerability. Resilience is in civil contingency speak is not about empowering in a human capacity. It's a governing ethos, and in truth, in the present state of affairs, a suspect term. What Karim Musuli and others witnessed was not state respect of human resilience, but authorities more concerned about an uprising or unrest than they were about looking after families. For Thomasina Hessel, council officers hiding badges and not wearing lanyards illustrated how residents was perceived as a dangerous threat. Police risk assessments, as you've heard, expected community tension, especially when the majority of those affected are believed to come from a Muslim background. For several days, the Westway remained a site of intimidation rather than refuge. Amidst this, RBKC deliberately and consistently lobbied against local residents as agitators with agendas. And on that, civil unrest became the official explanation for delay in removing from response to recovery. That is the justification that John Hetherington of London Resilience provided to chief executives for delayed handover on the 15th of June. The same day, Nicholas Holgate told Joe Farrer, without repudiation, that Grenfell residents could, quote, make this worse than it is, and the council is worried that they might need assistance from the police. Despite all of the overnight diplomacy to activate London Authority gold, the SCG meeting at 11 a.m. on the 16th of June still formally logged the delayed transition to recovery stage as caused by ongoing community tension. This false narrative should never have been officially endorsed in that way. The delay occurred because RBKC was incompetent, incapable, and resistant to external involvement, and regional and central government was unable or unwilling to force the issue. Everyone knew this, but instead of acknowledging it, the community were made to take the blame. Indeed, from Town Hall to Downing Street, documents show a state of elite panic obsessed with wanting to get a grip. Grip is not a government term of art. Its use reflects a mentality in which real engagement with people, as opposed to managing or ordering them, has no real prior thought or practice. Gripping is more about power than welfare, and again, not about people. In the post-Brexit electoral storm of June 2017, it also spoke to fears of broader collapse of social control, when Mark Sedwill, as National Security Advisor, warned colleagues that without getting a grip, this could become our New Orleans. He was referring consciously or otherwise to a seminal moment of recent history where structural discrimination revealed itself so obviously interwoven in a country's social fabric. As Hurricane Katrina showed in 2005 America, the Grenfell aftermath showed 2017 Britain to be in denial about the effect of economic and race inequality on people's capacity to withstand disaster. On this, the civil contingency system and its practitioners were at fault because of their indifference to inequality. First, none of the Cabinet or London documents as of 2017 referred to the Equality Act 2010. When Cabinet Office witnesses assumed that socio-economic disadvantage would be considered locally, given Equality Act obligations, they overlooked that Section 1 of the Equality Act, which would require such consideration, has never been brought into force by the post-2010 governments. Second, as to other in-force protected characteristics under the Act, including age, sex, disability, race and religion, which often intersect with socio-economic inequality, central government ought to have known that the public sector equality duty has simply not embedded in local authority culture across the country. Indeed, CCS breached its own duty in failing to press the point, just as London Resilience failed to embed the duty as part of its minimum standards. Third, at the local level, detailed knowledge of the equal treatment requirements in the Equality Act and their application to emergency planning was non-existent, despite the powerful indices in the population of North Kensington that ought to have made it a priority. Panel, without exception, the evidence before the inquiry in every module in Phase 2 has been that breach of the public sector equality duty is the norm. The default answer to the equal treatment questions put by your council throughout the phase has never done more and often less than articulate a general need to think about the vulnerable and otherwise prevent intentional abuse. That is not a way to combat discrimination. It signifies incompetency to prevent it. Why is it that Hissam and Nabil Shouker both raise discrimination with you? That Karim Musili says, we suffer and they prosper? That Mohammed Rasool told you they experience second-class exclusion as if refugees in their own country? And that they cannot escape the conclusion offered by Hanan Wahabi that had our community lived in a different part of the borough, on the more affluent side, had we been from a different class, had we been less ethnic, the response in the aftermath would have been immediate, it would have been present, it would have been felt. These are not just opinions. They are factual descriptions of a concrete situation. As an overwhelming African, Middle East and Caribbean diaspora population, many with intersecting lower incomes and disabilities, and with the vast majority of Muslim faith heritage, they have suffered because of a failure of human accounting. That absence of accounting produced an experience for BSR in the first period of the aftermath response that was inhumane. It treated people as numbers, not humans, herding them like cattle, ticking boxes about them, ignoring them as victims, requiring them to repeatedly relive their trauma to access services, containing their anger and pain, and even resenting it. More than anything, the treatment of BSR was felt as abandonment by the state when all aspects of their human geography had been lost. Neighbours, family, friends, homes, possessions, and means of access to the rest of life. While the civil contingency system at each level of government is to blame for these outcomes, there is also a bureaucratic mentality in an era of diminished state connection to society that lacks empathy and human responsiveness. Everyday moral restraints make it hard for people, especially public servants, to admit to inhumanity or comprehend that inhumanity is not restricted to bad people. And yet it occurs in bureaucracies and businesses, when basic moral restraints become neutralised or otherwise compromised. We say that there are powerful examples in this before the inquiry that need to be marked out, however uncomfortable for some to acknowledge. Consider Laura Johnson. She presided over the assignment of residents into hotels with no regard to their human well-being once warehoused in that way. Johnson's account is about the movement of bodies and things, not people. And she did this in a fashion that no one would ever do to their own family or friend or anyone whose lives they knew anything about. Nicholas Holgate regrets now the type of leader he was then. But when he protests that it was not part of his makeup as a career civil servant to refrain from invoking London gold for the undisputed reason in the log, that looks like we can't cope, what he really means is I am not the kind of person who would want to be seen as refusing help for those reasons. However, out of arrogance and a defensiveness, that is just what he did. And Catherine Hammond sees no failure in the civil contingency system, but only a single unprepared borough in the face of an unprecedented threat. She too has become desensitised to the moral deficits of a regime that she and the Secretariat were in charge of at the macro level, and which even in closing submissions, you are told, responded well. The lack of human accounting at Grenfell has at least been recognised by some. The British Red Cross, in self-described soul-searching of its own shortcomings, has advocated for a, quote, human-centred response that requires all of us to develop new approaches to empower and put people and communities at the heart of emergency response. Nicholas Hurd's final reflection to this inquiry was that the state must think differently about the critical distinction of doing things with people rather than things to people. What that should have involved was collaboration with local people and everyday community, respecting their agency and not just their vulnerability, and in a more genuine relationship of equals. That leads to the subject of real community engagement. Like people, actual communities are also unaccounted for in the system. The framework under the Civil Contingency Act limits supportive reach into communities in two main ways that are profoundly outdated. First, communities are not mentioned at all. Second, community interests are indirectly catered for by reference to the voluntary sector, which Section 25K of the 2000 Act designates as, quote, the activities of bodies other than public or local authorities whose activities are not carried on for profit. However, the Act and regulations only require local authorities to have regard to such activities, no more. The guidance adds only that such organisations must be factored into local civil protection arrangements. The subsidiarity regime therefore only requires limited consideration of community life. It makes the elitist assumption that organisations like the British Red Cross or the Royal Voluntary Services and places of religious worship will act as the representatives of ordinary people, as if they cannot represent themselves. The duty to develop community resilience does not exist under the civil contingency regime. Cabinet Office papers described it in 2015 as an untapped resource, and Michael Adamson puts it in this way: it's essential to make friends before you need them. But the law of emergency requires no one to do that. Without a discrete legal duty, the approach of RBKC management team on this issue was to do nothing. The so-called minimal standards for London, a misnomer given that these were neither a duty nor in force, only invited councils to seek out local partners and to put a documented strategy in place with a programme of collaborative work. RBKC never had a strategy. David Kerry described such a standard as aspirational stuff that wasn't on our agenda at the time and unachievable in any pragmatic or sensible way. He could only recall that his team had visited the local Church of England and Catholic diocese, but not the obviously more relevant Almanar Cultural Centre in terms of access to the Muslim demographic of Lancaster West. Panel, what community engagement for emergency planning meant for RBKC was tea with the vicar, and not with the imam. and nothing more. What occurred instead on the 14th of June was therefore self-help, human-to-human community action. In the absence of organised places of refuge and decent information channels in the first days of the disaster, community created them. The key rest centres were not set up by an arm's-length voluntary sector, but by people who congregated in trusted places known to them. When information was routinely taken by the authorities rather than given, BCR began to pull what they knew on social media groups and created their own lists. Volunteer organisations, especially Rugby Portobello and Clement James, willingly hosted, protected and facilitated recovery within their spaces. But they did not do it because RBKC asked them or coordinated them with any remote degree of partnership. Parts of the local voluntary community then supported BSR to represent themselves rather than represent them. And in doing that, they did something more meaningful than the formal and mediating role ineffectively assigned to their sector in the present legal framework. Once in the crisis of disaster, our opening address pleaded the imperative for outreach to BSR to discover what was needed. The British Red Cross evidence agreed that this absolutely meant to walk the relatively contained grid of streets and make contact with people and places to build links and learn what otherwise wouldn't be known. For the BSR director, what had been overlooked at Grenfell was a lot of social capital in that community, a lot of organisation, a lot of very dynamic people and leaders who already knew each other and actually could have been harnessed more effectively earlier on in the process. Instead, the various communities came together on their own, but there was profound cost, which BSR have explained to you in their evidence. They have described a traumatic experience for them, their families, and importantly their children, that will never go away. The damage wreaked disproportionate impact on working class people, predominantly of colour, who did not have the money, networks or options others have. It is for that reason that the aftermath and its harm has become a social justice issue for BSR that stands side by side with the causes of the fire. Turning then to the Borough. RBKC's contribution to the damage done is accepted, but its witnesses have continued to hide from the aggravating features of their wrongs. A fire of this nature would have challenged any council, but RBKC's deep-rooted inadequacies made the situation far worse. It was incapable of leading recovery not just because it was overwhelmed, but it was because it was culpable for the fire and inhumane because of its long-term disengagement from that state. Even with flaws in planning and shortcomings in initial response, a council that enjoyed pre-existing meaningful community engagement would have coped better, not least by correcting errors in real time based on BSR feedback. But RBKC's relations have degraded over the years. Nicholas Hurd now accepts the very clear impression that was forming quickly on the first day that the council was going to struggle to have the moral authority to lead. From the beginning, RBKC's leadership understood it would be criticised both for its culpability and its disconnection from Lancaster West. Kerry recalled that sprinklers were quickly on Holgate's mind. Holgate was reluctant for outside PR to be appointed because he thought this would be seen as the act of a guilty party. We have given you the references for when RBKC and TMO deflected blame onto BSRs, central government, and the media. Holgate's admission in evidence of suspicion only, i.e. prejudice, that BSR instigators were fabricating stories in order to further aims, should be seen in its true light as part of a pattern of bias against BSR amongst senior RBKC and TMO officers. It is important not to overlook the pre-fire animosity towards Grenfell residents by those with power over them. Laura Johnson had made it clear to the TMO as recently as March 2017 that they would be protected against residents from Grenfell, the bad-tempered place, complaining about minor matters with their own agenda, who are not to be taken seriously. In an email on the 16th of June 2017, she stoked the suggestion that residents would sabotage recovery by assuming without any foundation that Edward Daffan would lead the town hall protests. Robert Black allowed his TMO staff across the regeneration period to regard Daffan and Councillor Blakeman as a negative force, repeatedly warned Blakeman for breaching a purported conflict of interest, and would sack her from the TMO board for her criticisms of it immediately after the fire. As second in command and the principal advisor to Holgate during the emergency when Kerry was away, Tony Redpath's inquiry statement is littered with victim blaming. He articulates the view that as the emergency plans were premised on the borough being seen as a positive presence by the affected community, and that turned out not to be the case because people maligned the borough with anger, hatred and blame, then the delivery of effective services in the aftermath was, in his view, not possible. His fallacious reasoning is exposed by the principal issue. RBKC did not immediately act on nor plan for its own conflict of interest, firstly in being culpable for the fire, and second in long-term conflict with residents over low-quality works and fire safety standards. Cumulatively, this combination of defensiveness and prejudice rendered Holgate preoccupied with appearing to retain control of the response, rather than activating the massive London support that was needed. Although he resisted this in evidence to the inquiry, he was obviously concerned with optics, reputation and blame, and for that reason issued improper assurances well into the Thursday evening and beyond. On incompetency, we say that contingency planning in RBKC was a low priority function presided over by a traditional town hall staffing structure, one which lacked in diversity and showed disinterest in humanitarian issues. Priestley and Redpath line managed Kerry without expertise in their own right and no experience to carry out the roles expected of them after the fire. Holgate had neither real experience nor training. Kerry progressed through the ranks of contingency management largely due to serving time in the area rather than as a result of developing expertise through educating, training or experience. He combined long years in post with evident ability to speak the Cabinet Office lexicon and to navigate the convoluted byways of London resilience, acquiring the status as official advisor when his abilities clearly did not merit that role. By contrast, Rebecca Blackburn, educated, younger, female and less deferential, shone a light on the weakness of the service. She rightly regarded Kerry as overly bureaucratic and organisationally conservative. She had repeatedly pointed out the risks associated with the failure to conduct exercises to test the adequacy of the contingency managing plan and the cadre of volunteers, both of which she thought the borough was doing the very least we had to do. She correctly predicted to superiors that Kerry would not cope in the event of a major incident. Redpath told her to defer to her manager's experience. She understood the role of the team was not just to put the plans in place and make sure we look good on paper, but to ensure the organisation was able to respond effectively. Rather than have these issues addressed, Blackburn was seconded out of the team for 18 months. As of June 2017, she was the outlier in her workplace and stood out for a relative competence during the crisis. Many of the leading personnel leaned on her capability. Meanwhile, Kerry broke down from exhaustion by the first morning. Thereafter, he left inexperienced colleagues profoundly exposed to operate the day shifts and did painfully little himself during the nights. Proper prior monitoring would have shown that local government was chronically unprepared. As a result, RBKC made fundamental mistakes in the first 48 hours following the fire, from which it never recovered. Kerry was embarrassed by his own phrase, "We were what we were, we did what we did." But it revealed the truth. His many years preparing for an emergency could not ready the borough for anything more than a bus crash on the high street or a minor fire. And finally, at the level of borough, For all its self-aggrandising descriptions of being a resident democracy, the TMO's contribution to the emergency response was essentially reduced to providing delayed, incomplete and inaccurate information on residents and conducting delayed and inconsistent repairs for the walkway blocks. Thus, in the aftermath, any pretence the TMO had in being a representative and functional organisation and one that was well integrated within its community simply fell away. Turning then to the view from regional government. Beneath the complexity, branding and multiple stakeholding of London resilience lies the void that a major capital city does not have its own emergency agency. Instead, it has a duty rota system of chief executives available to provide ad hoc advice from a London-wide perspective, with additional bodies with various acronyms able to provide guidance and support, but without power or intent to discharge an emergency recovery function. The required leadership at Grenfell by selection of London's civil contingency specialists was therefore delayed because RBKC did not ask for it and London Local Authority Gold had no power to impose it. The stages by which the hierarchy of London resilience delayed even advising Nicholas Holgate that there was a serious problem nevertheless reflect the fundamental shortcomings of the subsidiarity system. At first, they kept their distance because the London Gold function, in Hetherington's words, was limited to scenarios requiring pan-London participation. And on subsidiarity doctrine grounds, the local chief executives were deemed to know better how to use his resources. This led to offers of help without insistence, with RBKC taking none of them up. But soon, London resilience became complicit in RBKC's incompetence. By taking the council's assurances at face value, they supported RBKC to continue to lead when it could not. Damage was particularly done by the telephone call between Holgate and the key London figures at 5:30 p.m. on the 14th of June. The discussion extended to facilitating political support for a council that needed, in Holgate's words, to be given a chance to do its job, and in circumstances where public criticism in the febrile post-election political climate was, as Hetherington assessed, starting to swell. After the call, Hetherington commended Holgate to be, quote, extremely logical and sensible and going through the right steps. Borough registered a relatively positive picture that they were within their capability and within their capacity. Sawyer held back from what he saw as a chief exec to chief exec call. John Barradell accepts now that he should have been far more assertive in testing what he was told. At the time, no one confronted the obvious. RBKC would never succeed alone, and a potentially culpable London landlord should not be leading on recovery. During the second day, complicity moved to disquiet, not just about events in Grenfell, but about London's role. Across regional and central government, it became clear that RBKC could not do the job, but the emails of Thursday night still speak of John Barradell planning to visit RBKC officers the following day on a scoping exercise with great uncertainty as to what London Resilience would actually do. There was never a formal letter sanctioning Barradell taking control. Instead, there was an email sent by Hetherington to London chief executives on behalf of Holgate and Barradell at 13:27 on the 16th of June that, quote, following a request from RB Kensington and Chelsea for strategic support, the London Local Authority Gold operations have been activated. This is the document that RBKC relied on in their opening as making clear that the formal transfer to London Gold had been completed by 13:27 hours on the 16th of June when Hetherington sent that email. The email does not say in terms that Barradell has taken over. Many people did not realise he had. And Nicholas Paget Brown was told about it at lunchtime rather than ordering it. The decision was never put to Cabinet or Council or formally endorsed by reference to any legal framework. What in fact happened on the Friday is that Joe Farah arrived from DCLG in late morning to find Borough still in a support role, armed with a mobile phone to call the chief executive of London councils and then text her permanent secretary. Farah essentially improvised a takeover of RBKC recovery in the corridor outside Holgate's office. The press release issued on the Saturday evening condemned the initial response as simply not good enough and introduced the new Grenfell Tower response team. This was not London Authority gold. It was a joint creature of regional and central government. Whatever improvements it made in the long run, the power of this improvised construct was founded upon the barest of legal foundations. The inquiry needs to reveal the extent of this improvisation so that Londoners and others do not live under the assumption that there is a rigorous, organised regional emergency service that will kick in when needed. Likewise, London resilience and central government leadership share responsibility for hitherto tolerating the absence of a genuine mechanism that could scale up response when a humanitarian predicament made it necessary. Viewing the disaster through the lens of people and community up through the layers of state truly brings home that the UK does not have a disaster management system. The major flaw of the existing Civil Contingency Act requires its unjustifiable gamble on a given local authority being sufficiently effective in its preparation, especially in the aftermath of a place-specific disaster that has led to mass displacement of socially, economic and otherwise disadvantaged populations. Grenfell has shown how subsidiarity provides central government with great discretion even when the system is manifestly failing. First, government departments are not scheduled responders under the CCA. That leaves them with various powers but not duties. Powers include that government can make orders to require or permit responders, third parties or itself to take action, with such orders subject to affirmative resolution by Parliament. However, in a case of urgency, a minister may make a written direction to act in place of orders that remain in force for up to 21 days and which require no prior legislative consent. Before and during the Grenfell aftermath, these powers lay unused, and instead, Holgate had a new system pushed upon him in that corridor. Second, central and regional government had no means of effectively predicting the resilience of the local government response because there was no national inspectorate or oversight function, and there still isn't. It is especially untenable that subsidiarity should prevail without proper independent auditing and inspection. That left RBKC not on the radar of DCLG's rare team, Borough, by his own admission, being overly impressed by RBKC's positive posture, and Sawyer being ignorant of the weakness in RBKC's system until he physically attended the town hall. Third, the lack of accountability of contingency planning places ordinary people at risk because they cannot easily complain to courts. Any public law challenge to state failure in response and recovery would face litigation difficulty in that the executive is legally regarded as enjoying a discretionary area of judgment in the governance of security and emergency. Sir Martin, with respect, will know as a judge that a 5:30 application for interim relief on that Wednesday afternoon would have got pretty much nowhere. What that means is that if planning does not take place in an effective and accountable way beforehand, then once the emergency begins, people and communities are dramatically exposed to the discretion of the state, particularly when it collapses in its function. Without its own planning and conduct duties under the CCA, the Cabinet Secretariat and DCLG were able to play by their own rules, and on that basis they floundered because they did not appreciate in time that the system had crashed. Hammond has convinced herself that a pick and mix approach to the central government concept of operations, CONOPS, made no difference. We disagree. ConOps requires a formal assessment of large-scale emergencies to establish whether severity levels require government intervention via COBRA and in accordance with a set of policy actions. Those actions include joint operations with local responders and sharing in the provision of information to the public. That is what the Civil Contingency Secretariat should have coordinated, and they failed to do so. As Dawes would put it to the Cabinet Secretary, once the event was recognised as more complex than 7/7, there was one clear lesson: we should have had a PM-chaired COBRA on the Wednesday. That must be correct. And rather than mere branding, as the Cabinet Office now suggests, the consequences were stark. First, a minister-led meeting limited the weight of oversight to a junior minister in Nicholas Hurd, 2 days in office, who had no relevant experience. Second, it sent a key message to local responders that central government oversight vested in junior ministerial monitoring as opposed to senior prime ministerial and cabinet level intervention. Third, it stalled the extent of cross-departmental assessment and common understanding of the magnitude of what was going on. Fourth, it allowed government to maintain a stance of expecting to be asked for assistance rather than proactively seeking it or imposing it. And fifth, government was ridiculously hands-off with Holgate on the first day, so much so that no one important even noticed his non-attendance at the first ministerial meeting. When government intervention finally came, it did so through Joe Farrar in the town hall corridor. No official direction or orders were required. Whatever benefits derived from this informal seizure of power, the event cannot be regarded as evidence of the subsidiarity resilience system working well, as has been portrayed to this inquiry. Neither should the CCS be content with the quality of its coordinating oversight and expert advice across the days of the emergency. CSS has been critical of RBKC's lack of grip, but as Melanie Dawes accepted, the failure to grip the situation extended to central government and could have been prevented if it had been clearer in the way that central government systems and decisions operated. The policies and lexicon of the Cabinet Office and London Resilience involve only a few stakeholders who speak the language of resilient subsidiarity. Like all specialist languages, it can have implications for separating the speaker from others. But this language risks being particularly disconnecting, especially here, where it caused officials in Whitehall and London to view themselves primarily as allies in waiting to the subsidiarity state below them, rather than in humanitarian service to people and community. This last evidence-gathering module for the inquiry has followed several years of investigating industry and government. For you to have heard BSR evidence is a profound reminder that the foundation of government, economics and law should be the people. Respect for the inherent dignity of people did not function as an overriding objective in the bureaucracies that dealt with BSR before, during and after the fire. The rationalist, professional outlook of modern bureaucracy has taught itself to be distant and disconnected from people and communities, and especially those who may be marginalised on grounds of class, race and disability. The damage done by such discrimination is profound. It is antisocial. What is needed is a discipline and practice of respecting dignity as a fundamental feature of what it means to be in civil, political and social service. People suffered in the aftermath of Grenfell Tower because of an inhumane borough, but that suffering was also caused by the design of the civil contingency system and its ambivalence towards equality and human dignity. The fact that this inquiry is not a commission into social housing or the future of the welfare state should not stop it from reporting on how government became antisocial in its indifference, and how that indifference caused the people who lived, survived or lost loved ones from this fire to pay such a terrible price.
Thank you very much, Mr. Friedman. The next statement is going to be made by Mr. James Maxwell-Scott, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. So, Mr. Maxwell-Scott, when you're ready, we shall be pleased to hear from you.
Mr Chairman, Ms Istefan, Mr Akbor. The Council had a central role in this module, not because it was the owner and landlord of Grenfell Tower, but because, as a local authority, it was a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act. This meant that, in the event of an emergency within the borough, it was expected to take the lead in providing rest centres, welfare and other forms of humanitarian assistance. The Council was also under a duty to undertake contingency planning. The inquiry called 6 witnesses from the Council in this module. Although none of them had read the Council's opening statement before it was submitted to the inquiry, the evidence of each of them was consistent with the admissions made in it. The Council's Chief Executive at the time expressly stated that he accepted all the admissions made by the Council in that opening statement. We invite the inquiry to find that all 6 witnesses gave their evidence candidly and did their best to assist the inquiry. As you know, the Council has made a commitment to candour. In the light of it, we have reviewed the entirety of the opening statement. The Council's position is 1, that it remains factually accurate, and 2, that it stands by all the admissions made in it. In the course of reviewing the opening statement and the evidence heard in this module, the Council has identified further areas where it fell short and therefore considers that it should make further admissions. The admissions which it considers it right to make are set out in full in its detailed written closing statement. At this stage, I will identify some of the most significant admissions which the Council makes in this module. The Borough Emergency Command Centre should have been operational in the Town Hall earlier than it was. It should have been more organised and efficient than it was. There were times on the 14th of June when it was overwhelmed. Council officers should have been deployed to premises known to be operating as rest centres earlier than they were. The Council failed to have in place an adequate system for registering the details of individuals. Nicholas Holgate should have activated the London Gold arrangements earlier than he did. These are all new admissions. They are made in the light of the evidence heard during this module. The following admissions from the Council's opening statement are worth repeating at this stage. There should have been more internal reporting up the management chain by the contingency planning team. There should have been greater oversight by the Council of that team and of the Council's emergency response capability. The Council should have had a humanitarian assistance plan. The arrangements which the Council had in place before the fire failed to set out how different parts of the Council would coordinate their communications. The Council failed to provide the public with clear, consistent communications, and, as a result, individual residents missed out on receiving support to which they were entitled. The Council had not trained enough rest centre managers. The Council did not run an adequate number of emergency response training events and exercises. There was insufficient attendance at the training events and exercises that were held. These failings were not technical or abstract failings of procedures and processes. They were failings that had a real and detrimental impact on individuals. The Council fully acknowledges this. This is why we included in our closing statement some examples of the impact on the bereaved, survivors and residents. The Council acknowledges that its failings had a disproportionate impact on people from diverse backgrounds and people with disabilities. For example, people who were fasting because they were observing Ramadan, people for whom English was not their first language, people with specific accommodation needs. Council apologises unreservedly for its failings. The Council has made changes since the fire. We identified some of them in a document served shortly before the oral opening statements, and I outlined some of them in my opening statement. You will recall that these changes were in a wide range of areas, including oversight of contingency planning, communications, community engagement, training and exercising. The Council is committed to making improvements, and changes continue to be made. We will update inquiry further in the recommendations part of Phase 2 later this year. Finally, in this introduction, I would like, on behalf of the Council, to thank a number of people. All the people from the local community and further afield who assisted at a time of great need. All the local community organisations, faith groups and charities who worked with the local community to deliver that assistance. And those councillors and council officers who worked long hours and willingly took on challenging tasks. There are 5 topics which I will address you on today. They are: 1, activation of a contingency management plan; 2, problems experienced by the bereaved survivors and residents; 3, activation of the London Gold arrangements; 4, the impact of a council's failings; 5, the future of emergency planning in London. My first topic is the activation of a council's contingency management plan. David Kerry was informed about the fire shortly before 2:30 a.m. He took on the role of Council Silver and began to activate the council's contingency management plan. As Council Silver, he was responsible for determining the level of a council's initial response. Rather than mobilising all relevant officers in the middle of the night, he opted for a more gradual mobilisation. This was because he wanted to reduce the risk of them being tired later in the day when he felt they might be needed more. One noticeable feature of Kerry's evidence was that he did not turn on his television or see any visual images of the fire for some hours. Had he done so, he would have taken a different approach and would have initiated the highest possible level of response. Looking objectively at the issue of the activation of a contingency management plan, the Council admits that the Borough Emergency Command Centre should have been operational in the Town Hall earlier than it was. The Council also admits that Council officers should have been deployed to premises known to be operating as rest centres earlier than they were. Council witnesses who spent time in the Borough Emergency Command Centre were asked about how effectively it operated once it was set up. In the light of their evidence, the Council admits that it should have been more organised and efficient than it was. The Council also admits that there were times on the 14th of June when it was overwhelmed. I turn next to the problems experienced by the bereaved survivors and residents, starting with what happened at rest centres on the 14th of June. Officers did not start arriving at the Rugby Portobello Club or the Clement James Centre in significant numbers until around 10 a.m. By then, both had been up and running for several hours. Many of the bereaved survivors and residents gave evidence about the situation in those rest centres on the morning of the 14th of June. The picture that emerged was one of confusion, disorganisation, lack of visibility of council officers, and lack of leadership from the council. The council's admitted failings were a significant cause of these problems. The council had not trained enough rest centres before the fire. On the 14th of June, it did not deploy enough officers of sufficient seniority to rest centres. It deployed officers to rest centres later than it should have done. the council's plans placed too much reliance on the British Red Cross. An example of this is the registration of individuals at rest centres and at the Westway. Registering individuals was ultimately the responsibility of the council. The fact that local community organisations and the British Red Cross assisted in attempts to record the details of individuals did not alter that position. The council admits that it failed to have in place an adequate system for registering the details of individuals. The lack of an effective registration system and the council's admitted communications failures were two major underlying causes of problems experienced by some of the bereaved survivors and residents during the first 7 days. A small number of Grenfell Tower residents were not told, but should have been told, that the council was offering them emergency hotel accommodation on the night of the 14th-15th of June. Some residents were allocated hotel accommodation that was not suitable for their personal circumstances. There was inconsistency in the information provided by the council to residents. Some residents were not aware of the full extent of the support which the council was offering. As a result, some residents, through no fault of their own, missed out on elements of a support package which they were eligible for and entitled to receive. One example of this is the fact that some residents were not aware of the full range of services they were entitled to receive while they were staying in hotels. Another example is that some residents were not aware how much money they were entitled to and did not receive as much as they should have done. The council deeply regrets the problems experienced by the bereaved survivors and residents and apologises to them. My next topic is the activation of the London Gold arrangements. In our opening statement, we suggested that the terminology used in relation to mutual aid could give rise to confusion. What became clear during the hearings in this module is that the terminology used to describe the activation of the London Gold arrangements also gives rise to confusion. The reasons for this are simple. A chief executive from one borough taking over the leadership of another borough's emergency response was something that had never happened before, and under the terms of the Gold Resolution was never intended or expected to happen. If one puts the confusing terminology to one side, it is possible to identify 4 key stages in the council's reliance on assistance from other London local authorities. The first was before 9 a.m. on the 14th of June, when the council began to receive assistance from its tri-borough partner, London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. The evidence suggests that it was supplying the council with rest centre managers by 8:30 that morning. The second stage was the email sent by the council to the London Local Authority Coordination Centre just after 4:30 on the afternoon of 15th of June. During the hearings, Hetherington agreed with our analysis that this was the first request by the council to LLACC for mutual aid. As such, it represented activation by the council of the London Gold arrangements. The third stage was reached about an hour and a half later, following the telephone call between Holgate and Baradell. By that point, Holgate had activated the London Gold arrangements to the full extent envisaged by the London Gold Resolution. The fourth stage was what happened at 2 p.m. the next day. Baradell took over leadership of the council's response from Holgate and became the local authority gold commander. As I said earlier, nothing like this had ever happened before. According to the arrangements which existed and still exist within London, it is something that was never meant to happen. Going back to the beginning, the council's position is that Holgate was right to take on the role of Council Gold on the 14th of June. He was the most senior officer employed by the council, and under its contingency management plan was expected to be Council Gold. It was clear from his evidence that Holgate believed that it was his duty to lead the council's response to the fire. Having reflected on the evidence heard in this module, the council's position on the activation of the London Gold arrangements is as follows. 1. Holgate should have activated the London Gold arrangements earlier than he did. 2. With the benefit of hindsight, one can see that Holgate focused too much on operational considerations at the expense of strategic ones. If he had found, or made, more time to reflect on strategic considerations, it is likely that he would have activated the London Gold arrangements earlier. 3. Holgate should have done so at some point after the 1730 meeting on the 14th of June. We have identified this time rather than an earlier time because of the following factors, each of which would legitimately have discouraged him from activating the London Gold arrangements earlier than that. First, the fact that activating London Gold had historically happened so rarely. Secondly, the viewpoint, commonly held within London at the time, that the London Gold resolution was more pertinent to an emergency which affected several local authorities than one which was geographically limited to a single borough. Thirdly, the council's contingency management plan encouraged the view that activating London Gold was not a step intended to be taken immediately. Fourthly, the existence of a tri-borough agreement meant that the council would more easily be able to draw on resources from two neighbouring local authorities. Fifthly, nobody involved in the conference call with Holgate at 5:30 p.m. on the 14th of June advised him that he should activate the London Gold arrangements. The evidence was that activation was not discussed. Sixthly, Hetherington's evidence was that he personally did not think that Holgate's decision was wrong. At the time, Hetherington was the deputy head of London Resilience. He has been head of it since 2018. His views, therefore, carry weight. So that is the council's position and the reasons for it. I end this topic by making it clear that the council stands by the admission made in its opening statement that its leadership was unable to cope in the days after the fire. My next topic is the impact of the council's failings. Mr. Chairman, as you know, our written closing statement contains a lengthy section entitled Reflections on the Impact of the Council's Admitted Failures. Today, I'm not going to repeat the detailed analysis in that section, but I'm going to summarise the key points. There are two main themes. The first is that, had the council performed to the level that it should have done, the experiences of the bereaved survivors and residents would overall have been significantly better during the first 7 days. The second is that it would be unwise to assume that everything would have been fine if only the council had performed to an adequate level. That sort of thinking breeds complacency about the robustness of the current national and local system for dealing with emergencies. It also runs the risk of ignoring an excellent opportunity to learn valuable lessons for the future. Taking the first theme first, the following are important respects in which an adequate level of performance by the council would have significantly improved the experiences of the bereaved survivors and residents during the first 7 days. First, training. The council has made substantial admissions in relation to its programme of training and exercises. It fully accepts that its response would have been better if it had conducted training and exercises to an appropriate standard. The following measures, which should have been in place, would all have assisted in improving the quality and effectiveness of the response. 1. A formal training programme for Council Gold, Council Silver and officers who worked in the Borough Emergency Command Centre. 2. More senior officers trained as Council Gold. 3. More trained BEC officers. 4. More training events. 5. A higher level of attendance at training events. 6. More trained rest centre managers. 7. A training programme which ensured that a contingency management plan was exercised at all levels at least once a year. Second, rest centres. Getting both more people and the right people to rest centres earlier on the 14th of June would have made a real difference at a crucial time. More trained rest centre managers would have made a difference. In the absence of a trained cohort of such managers within the council, the deployment of senior council officers in greater numbers and at an earlier time would have made a difference. The full deployment of the council's crisis support team would have made a difference. Earlier deployment of the housing officers and social workers who arrived at around 10 a.m. would have made a difference. Third, communications. Having a communications plan in place, which was fit for purpose and had been exercised, would unquestionably have improved matters. Had the council's communications function performed at an appropriate level, the number of residents who, through no fault of their own, missed out on elements of a support package would undoubtedly have been reduced. Fourth, better pre-existing relationships with local community organisations. It was clear from the evidence heard in this and other modules that community was very important to the residents of Grenfell Tower, the Lancaster West Estate and North Kensington. Local community organisations played an important part in building that sense of community and supporting its members. Many local community organisations have been providing valuable support to local residents for decades. The Council has previously acknowledged that it did not listen to residents as much as it should have done. The Council should have done more before the fire to build effective relationships with local community organisations and residents and to include them within its emergency plans. Had it done so, it would have been better placed to coordinate and direct local community organisations. This would have addressed the problem, described by many witnesses, of local community organisations being willing and able to help, but experiencing a lack of overall direction from the council. I now turn to my second theme, but it would be unwise to assume that everything would have been fine if a council had performed to an adequate level. There were many respects in which the support provided to the bereaved survivors and residents could and should have been better. In our submission, it is appropriate to ask the question whether what went wrong was specific to RBKC, or whether some elements of what went wrong reveal problems with the systems in place across London as a whole at the time. Only by engaging with this question can one ensure that anyone caught up in a disaster on a similar scale in London in the future is better served and supported. Only by engaging with this question can one ensure that all relevant lessons are learned. In our written closing, we have done a detailed analysis of respects in which what went wrong revealed wider problems. What I'm going to do now is to summarise the main points of that analysis of the wider problems. I will summarise points relating to emergency planning before turning to points relating to the response to the fire. Point 1. How the Council's contingency planning team compared to that in other London local authorities. In our submission, the size of the team was fairly normal and all members of the team were suitably qualified and experienced. Point 2. Reporting and oversight. In practice, the Council's contingency planning team reported in more detail to London Resilience than it did to the Council's senior management. This reporting was done through the minimum standards for London system. In reality, the phrase minimum standards for London was somewhat misleading. The way the minimum standards for London system worked was as follows. Each year, every local authority in London would send London Resilience its self-assessment of how it should be scored against the so-called minimum standards. In 1 year out of 2, that self-assessment was peer-reviewed by members of the Sub-Regional Resilience Forum. Regardless of whether it was peer-reviewed or not, the scores were converted into a traffic light format. So, for example, in 2016, each local authority ended up with approximately 35 separate ratings of red, amber or green. The reason why we say that the phrase minimum standards for London was somewhat misleading was that London Resilience expressly stated that, quote, it was never intended or expected that the MSL would be 100% green in all boroughs, unquote. So local authorities were not expected to comply with all the minimum standards. But it goes beyond that because there was no minimum number of minimum standards which an individual local authority was required to meet. And there was no mechanism available to London Resilience or any other pan-London organisation to take action to improve the performance of a local authority which was getting large numbers of reds and ambers. In 2016, which was a peer review year, RBKC achieved 1 red, 7 ambers and 25 greens. This was far from the worst performance. One local authority achieved 3 reds, 16 ambers and 16 greens. Yet the evidence heard in this module was that London Resilience had no power whatsoever to enforce the minimum standards. Point 3, emergency plans. Emergency plans are not procedures or protocols. They are plans. They represent attempts to plan for how best to address unlikely future events of an unpredictable nature. Written protocols and procedures are appropriate for tasks which arise frequently and which benefit from being carried out in the same way on each occasion. Major emergencies are rare, and no 2 emergencies are alike. An effective response to an emergency requires flexibility and the ability to adapt pre-existing plans to fit the situation being faced. Point 4, training. Training raises similar issues about the need for flexibility. Training is important. I would go further and say that it is essential, but it would be naive to think that an adequate programme of training and exercises will prevent all problems. However hard one tries to make training exercises realistic, they can never replicate the experience of a real-life emergency. Training exercises are not a substitute for first-hand experience. But many people working in senior positions in local government will, through no fault of their own, ever have had to respond to an emergency. It would be highly unusual and resource-intensive to create a scenario for an exercise which was realistic and on the scale of a Grenfell Tower fire. The only exercise we are aware of which fitted both of those criteria was Exercise Unified Response in 2016. That was a London-wide exercise which took 2 years to plan. As can be seen from the London Risk Register, there is a wide range of potential emergencies scenarios. Although it did not identify a tower block fire as a risk, it did identify flooding, drought, storms, heat waves, aviation accidents, public disorder, terrorist incidents, and rail strikes, to name just a few. It is quite simply impossible to train for all potential emergency scenarios, and there is no expectation that local authorities will do. The system is premised on the idea that staff who have exercised one scenario will have the flexibility to apply their skills and training to what may be a very different scenario. Point 5. Information about persons who may be vulnerable following an emergency. This is an area where there is a significant gulf between what people understandably believe the national system should be and the system itself. In 2017, no local authority was expected to maintain a consolidated master list of every vulnerable person in the borough. The relevant Cabinet Office guidance stated that it would be impossible to maintain a central, up-to-date list of vulnerable people. Emergency planning in respect of vulnerable persons has proved to be a long-running challenge across London. Hetherington told the inquiry that the problem had still not been cured and that an interagency data sharing agreement was still being worked on. Point 6. Local community organisations. The Council has admitted that it should have done more before the fire to build effective relationships with local community organisations and to include them within its emergency plans. The context to this admission is that very few council officers lived within the borough, whereas local organisations have been embedded within the North Kensington community for decades. These local factors increased the need for the council's emergency plans to include and make use of the capabilities of local community organisations. This should not disguise the fact that the level of engagement with the voluntary sector required by legislation was low. Regulation 23 of the 2005 regulations states that Category 1 responders must have regard to the activities of voluntary organisations. This is a most vaguely phrased obligation which sets the bar extremely low. It was notable, but unsurprising, that several of the witnesses called from community and voluntary organisations emphasised the need for more legislation to address this issue. I now turn to points relating to the wider problems in relation to the response to the fire. I start with what is the logical starting point, the implications of how events unfolded in the first few hours. People who fled from the tower did so in all directions. They did not have their details recorded systematically inside the cordon. Once outside the cordon, if they were not taken to hospital, they were free to go wherever they wished. Many made their way to local premises that had opened as unofficial rest centres. At least 5 such unofficial rest centres had opened and provided support to residents by 9 a.m. This turn of events had the following implications. Implication 1. It would never have been possible for the council, or indeed anyone else, to have ensured that there was at all times a single rest centre. Implication 2. Reaching a point where there was a single official rest centre was desirable, but the transition to that point was always going to be difficult. My next point, my second point, is about communications, which are incredibly important in an emergency. Even with a good plan and a good team, effective communication in an emergency is a challenge. In our submission, whoever was tasked with communicating the message about available humanitarian assistance would have faced the following challenges. The challenge to be heard, the challenge of reaching all residents, the challenge of communicating an accurate and up-to-date message in a situation that was inevitably fast-moving, the challenge of resources being diverted to address questions which were understandably being posed about the causes of the fire, the challenge of resources being diverted to address questions about the effectiveness of the response to the fire, the challenge of dealing with negative sentiment and, in some instances, hostility. My third point is about individuals, registration of individuals and sharing information about vulnerable persons. Michael Adamson, the Chief Executive of the British Red Cross, told the inquiry that data sharing is always an issue. Creating a comprehensive list of individuals and then making best use of the information in it would always have been a complex task. This is particularly so given that people who fled from the tower did so in all directions. Some went to one unofficial rest centre, some went to another, some went to multiple centres, and some went to family or friends and did not go to any centres. Moving then to the related issue of vulnerable persons, the expectation at the time would have been that the Council adopted and followed the list of lists approach. The list of lists approach has two inherent limitations. First, it will not produce information instantly. Even in circumstances in which it works as intended, there will be some delay in information being provided. Secondly, it is unlikely that the information provided will be completely accurate and up to date. My fourth and final point is about the activation of the London Gold arrangements. If one wants to assess how robust the system was, one has to consider how the arrangements were meant to operate, rather than the unprecedented course that events took. If Holgate's activation of the London Gold arrangements had followed the hypothetical normal case, there would have been no takeover by Borough. Holgate would have continued to lead the Council's response to the fire, with support from whichever Chief Executive happened to be on the on-call rota at the time. Drawing the threads together, three overarching themes emerge. The first is that there is always a gap between what survivors and residents need and expect and the level of response a local authority can achieve in the first 24 hours. The second is that the solution to addressing those needs and expectations was not found by carefully implementing the existing framework within London. It was found by operating outside of the existing framework, by breaking boundaries, and by people, in effect, making up a new framework as they went along. The third is that, in the event of a large-scale emergency in London, even one confined within a single borough, it is highly likely that the local authority will need to rely on assistance from other London local authorities. This brings me to my final short topic, the future of emergency planning in London. The evidence heard in this module has revealed serious limitations in the formal arrangements that existed within London for responding to an emergency of the complexity of the Grenfell Tower fire. In our submission, serious consideration needs to be given to improving the London-wide arrangements for contingency planning. Because there will be a separate recommendations part to phase 2 of the inquiry, I don't want to go into too much detail today about what changes might be desirable. We will make detailed submissions about recommendations in accordance with the inquiry's request at the relevant stage later this year. However, I can indicate at this stage that in our view, careful consideration should be given to the following 3 ideas. Having a cohort of persons trained and available to provide urgent humanitarian assistance 24 hours a day across London. Greater external oversight and auditing of the emergency planning capabilities in London. Improving the training of those on the London Gold on-call rota. The Council is very conscious of the recent anniversary. Although this is the aftermath module, it does not address events that took place after the 20th of June 2017. The Council is fully aware that the aftermath of the fire did not end on that day. The bereaved, survivors and residents continue to experience the impact for many weeks, months and years. Many of them still experience the impact today. The Council apologises for its failings in pre-planning and in its response to the fire. I would like to finish with what its leader, Elizabeth Campbell, wrote in her open letter to mark the 5th anniversary. She said, "I want you to know that I am deeply sorry for the Council's failings and the suffering that so many people experienced at Grenfell and in the aftermath."
Thank you very much, Mr. Maxwell-Scott. The next statement is going to be made on behalf of the London Fire Commissioner, but that on the timetable will be at 2 o'clock. And I think given the time that we've now reached, the right course would be to adjourn at this point, and we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please. Thank you very much.